Let's bring in now Stephen Hamilton, Assistant Professor of Economics at George Washington University. Stephen, thanks very much for your time. Before we get started with our discussion, I just want to play you a little of what the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, had to say. Now, he's been in briefings all day with the RBA and regulators, the Treasury Secretary, but he had this to say about the status of the budget. Have a look.
And there are other factors working against us, including some pressures on the budget which were not disclosed or booked by the previous government, and I'll get into that at a subsequent opportunity. Great.
What are those unexpected pressures you said in the budget? What did they leave you that you didn't know?
I'll have more to say about that on another occasion. Thanks very much.
So there you go, Professor Stephen Hamilton. We've heard similar messages before by incoming governments, haven't we? Look at this black hole that they've left us.
Yeah, I have to. I'm glad you showed us that, Kieran, because when he said that in the press conference, my eyebrows certainly went up. So, we have the Charter of Budget Honesty, which Peter Costello introduced, after they came to government in 1996. And that's meant to enforce a sense of transparency over the budget process, right? So governments before they go to an election, they have budgets, they get to decide what's in those budgets, they get to decide the forecast. But after the election is called, the Treasury and Finance Departments come up with a document called the Pre-Election Economic and Fiscal Outlook, which is meant to be an independent representation of the national books. And that's meant to stop, in fact, these kinds of budget black holes from emerging. So I'm fascinated to know what we're going to learn over the next few months when the Treasurer starts to take the country through it. But at least on what we know, we have very large structural deficits going out, as far as the eye can see. We have huge spending pressures in a number of programs. And of course, as we've talked about a lot on this program, massive sort of short-term inflationary pressures which are pushing up interest rates. So all of these things are really buffeting the budget, and it's a hell of a task for the new government to deal with.
You've argued today in the newspaper that they should leave any bold reform to a second term to focus basically on competence for the next 3 years.
Yeah, I don't know if you've noticed in the papers, Kieran, but every man and his dog has their cap out after 9 years of the coalition asking for a handout from the government. I think the pressure on them to deliver is going to be absolutely tremendous. And it sort of reminds me of that time just before the 2007 election, where Peter Garrett told someone at the chairman's lounge, "Oh, don't worry, it'll all be different when we get in there." So the risk, I think, for Labor is taking government, is keeping that kind of discipline, ensuring that they don't get carried away, that they don't, go off on a whole lot of sort of wild goose chases to solve all of these problems. I think they need to focus in the short term on delivering their agenda, fix the budget, give the country a bit of stability, bring good government back to the country. These are the kinds of consolidations I think that we need for the next few years. And a lot of newspaper editorials are clamoring for big, grand reforms. But my view would be kick that can down the road a little longer. Your margin at the election is going to be pretty fine, certainly less than half what John Howard had in 96. And he almost lost the election in 98 on the GST. So I just don't think Labor's in a position to do that. Just as Tom was saying before I came on the program, if they can show themselves to be a good, strong, responsible, reliable government, they might get a swing to them next time. And then that would position them really well to start making the case for the big reforms that the country needs.
It's interesting, Stephen. Yeah, I thought your piece made a lot of sense, talking about being incremental, deliver on your commitments, fix the budget as best they can, and deal with climate change. Now, in terms of the climate change issue, sort of dealing with it sounds flippant, but I know exactly the argument you've read. I've just been reading your piece where you say we've come through a really dysfunctional period. So it's not actually that hard to get some functional policy in place in that space.
That's right. Do a few things and do them really well. right? So we've had this crazy 15-year period on climate policy. I mean, if you go back and look at the 2007 report, Kieran, that's 15 years ago, right, that John Howard commissioned, and you read through that report, it's kind of staggering that a coalition government produced that document, right? And now we stand here 15 years later and we still don't have a market mechanism to reduce Australia's emission, right? And in the meantime, we've had just incredibly hectic chaos, right, on climate policy over that period. And so I think the government put forward a very clear plan at the election around the safeguard mechanism and some of the other things. If they could achieve that plan, right, get it right, and there's a lot of detail to work out, I think that's a huge achievement and frankly something that they can absolutely go to the next election and point to and say, here's something we did, right? Now let us do more.
Yeah, indeed. And I do recall, I think it was the Shergold report from memory that in 2007, the then head of the Prime Minister's department. But let's look at this issue because it was raised with me by a number of Labor people in the lead up to the election. And I guess I just want to get your reflections on it because it's quite an interesting point. When you talk to Labor figures in government now and certainly in the lead up to it, they had said to me that, you know, counterintuitively, it might actually have been a better election to lose the last one because could you imagine how much of a legacy all of that expenditure would have been on Labor as budget managers if they were to deliver that COVID response, given where they'd come from in terms of their economic and budgetary legacy?
See, to be honest with you, Kieran, I just don't buy into this law that a lot of the party people say, right? And if we compare governments over time, most of the differences that we see in terms of their economic management, in terms of interest rates, debt, taxes, all of these other things, are really not a lot to do with the government itself. They're mostly to do with external circumstances that were imposed on them, right? So Labor was saying they're lower taxing than the government. Well, that was partly because Labor last held government following an almost recession around 2008, which pushed down tax revenues. So I think I like to assess each side based on the fundamentals, right, rather than any particular measurement. And I will tell you that, you know, I thought Katie Gallagher in that press conference earlier is already saying the right things. And I think if you look back, finance ministers historically have been really important in imposing discipline. So back to sort of Lindsay Tanner and then Penny Wong under Labor, Matthias Cormann under the coalition, right? So I think Katie Gallagher will be someone to look to that can kind of impose that kind of discipline, that can put in place the fiscal rules they need to correct the budget, and that can kind of help push the process through this tumultuous time. I will say it's not a good time to take government now either, you know, with inflation and interest rates skyrocketing, the kind of global geostrategic headwinds buffeting Australia. So no matter who would have won this time round, I think it would have been a tough few years for budget and economic management.